First of all, make the invoice date column green as it's a data entry field. Move on to the first cell of the reference column. Enter the formula using the if condition so that we only get the reference if the invoice date is filled in. Go to the first cell of invoice date and define the data validation. Copy and paste to the whole column and type in some dummy data. Here I'm adding the max formula to the reference, so that the reference can follow the sequence along with that of the vendor invoice. Go to the first cell of the invoice number. Here I try to bring up the conditional format to make the mandatory entry field cells green when the invoice date is filled in. Now we generate some invoice numbers. I'll explain why we generate these numbers instead of using the one already on your invoice after we finish off the bookkeeping part of the accounting system. Here I add the if formula so that invoice numbers will only be generated when the invoice date is filled in. Now I simply go to the Vendor tab, double left click and duplicate the worksheet. And rename it as Customer. However, the Customer tab doesn't appear on the toolbar. So we go back to the table summary and add the Customer tab under Table Name. Fill in the description in the language columns. Here I'm correcting the Chinese description of my customer invoice interface. Then I continue on the Chinese description of the customer list. Now the customer list should be there. Alright, we move on to change the vendor name to customer name. Here I just make some dummy customer names. You can experiment it with your own. Go to whatever cell, Ctrl-Shift F3 to bring up the name manager. Here I found some duplicate names because I duplicate worksheets before. Select the table Create in the customer list and edit the name as Customer. We'll be using this name afterwards. Now we are creating the customer selection dropbox formula. Here is the first cell whole range format that we used a lot before. This is the preview. Go to whatever cell and bring up the name manager again, new, and then give it a name, select customer, and paste the formula we've just created here. Go back to customer invoice. On the first cell of customer name, Alt-OD to bring up the validation, list, and then under source, F3, and click select customer. There we go. However, it doesn't change with different language. Therefore, we need to amend the formula in the customer list. Go back to the first cell of customer name. Replace the B3 in the second match with the B3 in the customer invoice tab. Remember F4 to lock it. Now we can go back to the customer invoice. Let's change the language. Our customer name should be in Chinese as well. Let's switch to English and paste the first cell to the rest of the column. And now our customer list should be in English. Here I OOD to edit my original conditional format because some of the cells are calculate fields that don't require any data entry. Go back to chart of accounts. Here I'm going to return all the type R accounts for the income description selection. Let me create a column count R to hold the income accounts. For simplicity, I copy the formula from the count P column. Then I go to the first cell of the count R column and change the criteria from P to R. Here I add a freeze pane so that I can keep the process type column visible. Now when you change the language in chart of accounts, the count R column changes as well. Let's drag down to expand the toolbar. Pick a cell and enter the formula for the income account selection drop box. Ctrl+C to copy the formula. Ctrl+Shift+F3 to bring up the name manager. Oops, we have two expense drop boxes because we duplicate worksheet before. Doesn't matter, we just delete this one. That's much better. Now hit New to create a new one. Name it Income Dropbox and paste the formula we just did. Go back to the customer invoice. In the first cell of the description column, Alt-DL to bring up the validation, allow list, and under source press F3 and click the income dropbox. Then you should be able to select income account under description. Simply copy and paste special to apply the validation to the whole column. However, even when we change the customer invoice language, we still have the English selection. Let's add some dummy data. The net amount can be calculated by subtracting the invoice by text, so I bring up the conditional format and change the applied range. Here I just add a border to separate the income and settlement. Now we enter the formula for the net amount. For the payment date, I set it to be the same as the invoice date. Go back to the bank accounts list. Copy the formula from the withdrawal bank and paste special formula to the deposit bank. Now go to the first cell of the deposit bank and change the language source from the bank account list to that of the customer invoice. Remember F4 to lock the language. Now when I change the customer invoice language and go back to deposit bank, I should have deposit bank in the new language. Change the customer invoice to English. The deposit bank is back to English. Here I go to cell C6 in the bank account list. I create a formula for the deposit bank selection drop box. Copy the formula and Ctrl-Shift F3 to bring up a name manager. Click New and then name it Select Deposit Bank. Paste the formula we just did. And then go back to the customer invoice. Inside the first cell of deposit bank, allow list F3 underscores to select deposit bank. Then copy and paste special by formula to apply the validation to the whole column. When I change to Chinese, the list should be in Chinese now. For the next video, we'll be going through the last part of the bookkeeping. Ciao.